Hi, how you doing? You okay? Yeah, I don't do the formal academic talk, so play along. All right, so thank you guys for having me here. Today we're going to talk about the global politics of British black power, political blackness, anti-imperialism, and the white working class. It's a kind of quasi-history of black power in the UK, which you probably didn't know existed. And then we're going to try and drag it into the present, because I'm a sociologist, I'm not a historian, so we'll try and make it relevant. Okay, so let's begin. Let's begin with a question. Does anyone know where this is? I like the accent. Do that again. All right, fair enough. Does anyone know where this is? Same place. Birmingham, but in Alabama. Right? So I'm making this analogy because in 2008, someone at Birmingham City Council redesigned the website, right? And they were supposed to put this skyline on, but they put this skyline on. Right? And the reason I bring this up is A, to get a laugh, but B, also that this isn't the first time that the two Birminghams have been confused. If you go back to 1965, you would find that there were reports. Well, actually, there weren't reports. There were actual events of cross-burning by the apparent KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in Birmingham in the UK. All right, so I'm going to play you a little clip to prove my point. If I can get back there. Let's do this. Okay, so, and I love these little newsreels because they just show us how crazy things were back in 1965. There you go. Let's see if I can make this bigger.
The big problem facing the police now is whether this is the work of local hooligans or political fanatics. Coming so quickly after the Leamington incident, the burning cross of Leamington, and reports of a secret Ku Klux Klan organisation in the Midlands, it could be argued that this is the result of local youth reading about all this in the newspapers and seeing it on television. Another thing is that the couple affected, Mr. and Mrs. Larkin Henry, aren't involved in any political organisations. They're a normal couple. They get on well with their neighbours and haven't experienced any violence before. But whoever's responsible, there is now fear in the street. Many of the residents are coloured, and they're quite convinced that this is the work of political fanatics. Some have said to me, Ku Klux Klan. Police now, of course, are treating it very seriously. They've got to. And they're appealing for the motorist who spotted the burning cross last night to come forward and help them. They're sure he's not involved, but he may be able to give them a lead to the people who nailed the cross on the door of this house in Albert Road. Earlier today I talked to Mrs. Ruby Henry. Mrs. Henry, what happened?
Well, last night, 11:05, my husband came down here to put his spark light, and no fire was at the door. And then about 15 minutes after, I could hear a big shouting that the front is on fire. And then when he rushed down, the door was on fire, there was a cross on the door and it was blazing. He tried to take the cross off and I rushed to get some water.
And then what happened?
To throw on the door, and then after we get it out, he went to the police station and let the police know what happened.
The shouting had come from a motorist passing by again?
Yes.
Have you any idea why someone should hang this cross against your door?
No idea at all.
Is your husband involved in politics, or does he belong to West Indian organisations?
No.
Have you had any incidents here before?
No.
How do you get on with your neighbours?
All right.
How long, in fact, have you lived in this street?
4 years.
And how do you feel now about living here?
Well, I don't think I'll stop here any longer.
It's frightened you, has it?
Yeah, terribly.
Your children, you've sent them away to friends, I guess?
Yeah.
What about your husband? What does he think about it?
Pardon?
What does your husband think about it?
Well, I tell him I won't stop here, so he had to decide to find somewhere else to put me.
Do you think this has been done by hooligans or by some political fanatics?
No idea at all.
Now, you all live in this street. What do you think about this incident last night?
Well, I may say, well, according to what is going around and being this Ku Klux Klan, organization, to myself, I think they might be one of them that do it, you see.
You don't think it's just local hooligans?
I don't think so.
What about you?
I don't think it's local hooligans. I think it's the Ku Klux Klans.
But you haven't had any trouble in the street before?
No, not before.
And white and coloured people live here quite
yes,
well, don't they?
we live here quite well and we get on very peacefully.
What about you? What do you think?
Well, I didn't know about it till this morning, you know. I didn't know anything about it last night. We was in bed early, you know. But I don't think it's hooligans, you know.
You think it's these political fanatics, do you?
Yes, yes.
What about you over here? Can you come forward with us?
Well, I just don't know what it's there. Let's say it happened last, about 11:30 last night.
Yeah.
Well, I just come in from work, just turned 11:15, you know. And when I passed here, I didn't see nothing.
Yeah. Have you had any incidents in this street in the past?
No, not to my knowledge.
And you get on all right with white people living in
Oh,
the
yes,
street?
fairly.
All right. Can I ask the gentleman here? What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's definitely an organization. It's an organization of the Ku Klux Klan.
You don't think it's perhaps local hooligans who've read about the incident at Leamington in the paper and have decided to...
No, I think this is definitely an organization with a transport, because this is a big thing that they take around. It must be
So
some
why should
organization.
they pick on this family? They're not leaders of your community at all?
No, well, I think the clan themselves is against every coloured race, really, and it's not just anybody, but not just who is in the organization.
Yeah. Can I just ask this lady here, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I don't really think it's the Ku Klux Klan. I don't think so. I think they hear and see a lot on television and read about it. Myself, I don't think so.
How do white people get on with
Very, very well. I live next door to Cecil there, and we are really happy on it. Yes, we're the best of neighbours.
Okay, I don't think Cecil was convinced. The reason I brought that to you is that at this moment in time in 1965, essentially the linkages between the US and the UK in terms of its race relations were becoming more and more an analogy. Now, the rumors about the Klan were never substantiated and probably never true, but they were elements of a white, racist, far-right agenda against what we would term colored people. Why I bring this up is that essentially post-65, you start to see the emergence of black power in the UK, and I'm going to kind of run through how events like this laid the grounds for an emergent black power movement in the UK. We'll talk about British black power in general, but I want to focus on the kind of global politics that this political movement put forward, and then we're going to look at the legacy of that for the current stuff. We'll have a joke about Donald Trump or something, okay? All right. So black power. Black power is normally linked to the kind of later stages of the American civil rights movement, the sort of disenchantment with the failure of the American civil rights movement to provide the economic, social, and political justice that the movement initially thought it could do by gaining legal equality for African Americans. Most famously espoused by Stokely Carmichael, but normally narrated against and with the civil rights movement. So on one side, you normally have the civil rights movement is non-violent, it's about integration. And in the black power movement is about violence, it's about separation. What has happened over the last 20 years beforehand is that normally ideas of black power have been looked in what we call through methodological nationalism. So the idea of just looking at it as a kind of national thing in the US. What we've found in the last 10 years of scholarship is actually there's an alternative global history of black power. And that's that global history that's going to locate its emergence in the UK. So if I said this debate, it's normally kind of pushed between two figures, the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and the division between their politics. Black power is kind of found, is iconic expression in the Black Panther Party. That's Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party. We celebrated their 51-year anniversary on October 15th. And the Black Panther Party gives you a sense of how global black power was in its kind of conception of how racism in the US linked up with a global system of imperialism. So you would see the Black Panther Party regularly protest against the Vietnam War. You would see Huey Newton meet Chinese elites and link up with the Palestinian cause towards the late 70s, early 80s. But, let's have a show of hands. Does everyone know who that is? Angela Davis. Anyone know who that is? Olive Morris. But you're not allowed to speak, Catherine, because you already know this stuff. Anyone else but Catherine that knows? You all know it's Olive Morris now, you could cheat. All right, that's Olive Morris. Now, Olive Morris was born in 1952 in Jamaica. She comes over to the UK. Unfortunately, she passes away in 1979. If you ever get any chance, Olive Morris could have been Angela Davis. I've gone back and I've read her university essays. She's a very, very bright woman. And her history of activism is to be valorized. It's a shame that no one knows about her, but that gives away the fact that not many people know about the British Black Power movement of which she was a part of. And we'll come back. Olive ends this talk. We'll come back to Olive. Okay, so the UK has its own distinct history. So whereas you may know Angela Davis, you won't probably know about this UK history. Linked to the new Commonwealth immigration that really kicked off in the late 50s, early 60s from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The forms of racial discrimination that these new Commonwealth migrant groups encountered in the UK, the Immigration Acts of 62, 68, and 71 that tried to limit their ability to come into the country and also to bring their families over. And remember, these people came as British subjects, they didn't come as migrants. The employment discrimination, colour bars, rampant across trade unions, education, housing, and of course, an oldie but goodie of police brutality. Linked to this, you also had Powellism, Enoch Powell's famous 1968 speech in Birmingham, which I just taught today to my students, about the rivers of blood. And what we find is that UK Black Power was inherently formed by Marxism, US Black Power, anti-colonial activism, and the discourses in the Third World. And we'll talk about the Third World as an idea a bit later. So Black Power in the UK, normally you can date it, some people date it from two distinct points. One is Malcolm X's second visit to the UK in 1965, or 1967 when Stokely Carmichael gives a talk at the Dialectics of Liberation Conference in London. I think 1965 is the starting point if we're going to have some kind of historical debate. Because from that, someone called Michael X, I'm not going to get into who Michael X was, found an organization called the Racial Adjustment Action Society, which is actually just short for RAS. So if you know what that means, which some of you do, it was just to get elites to say RAS, right, in the media. And this was a response to the failure of the Race Relations Act in 1965 to do the same thing that the civil rights movement had been unable to do in the US, right, which was to secure economic, social, and political justice for communities suffering racism. And there's a direct link between the emergence of that kind of legislation and the emergence of Black Power in the UK. And in fact, the first UK Black Power group outdates, RAS basically outdates the conference that Stokely Carmichael talks at in 67. So Black Power groups in the UK, I'm just going to give you a good overview and then we're going to get into their politics. So the kind of first real organization other than RAS came 2 years later in 1967 called the United Coloured People's Association. That would then morph, bits of it would then morph into the Black Unity and Freedom Party in 1970. Quite famously, the Black Panther movement would be founded in 1968. In 1973, it would change its name to the Black Workers' Movement. We'll address why that changed. The Black Liberation Front, which emerged in 1971. And there were other affiliated groups. Darcus Howe was part of a group called the Black Eagles, and who would eventually join the Black Panther movement. The Fasimbas would eventually join the Black Liberation Front. There was the Brixton Black Women's Group, which would come out of work by Olive Morris a bit later. You had the Indian Workers Association, which was like a much older grouping, which used to do political work with Black Power groups, and the Institute of Race Relations. Most of this history happens in London, but it happens in other places as well, such as Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester. But the kind of stuff that's been left over is very, very London-centric. Although I did find Black Power groups in Huddersfield, so there you go. If you ever go north, go to Huddersfield. And what you find in these groupings is a mixture of Pan-Africanism, anti-colonial politics, Marxism, and black nationalism. And there's a certain national reach to these groups. They connected across into all those cities I just mentioned. So if you were a Black Power activist in London, you regularly went to Birmingham, you regularly went to Manchester. There was a kind of circuit that you did. And they replicated elements of what the US Black Power movement was doing, such as articulating that black is beautiful, so the idea of black history, of the black image, of black culture, black self-determination in issues such as education and housing, so the kind of start of supplementary schooling can be linked to the Black Power movement, and black self-defense, dealing with police brutality and racist terrorism. And that's what it is racist terrorism when you can't walk the streets, right? And also working with the community. Black Power groupings in the UK worked with the community. If you look at it as a kind of general, if you look at Black Power and all its organizations in the general, what you find is that they had a very similar global politics to the US version of Black Power, and specifically groups like the Black Panthers. They would regularly argue that the British left had more in common with the ruling class than with the actual workers who were from the new Commonwealth, and we'll get into that. They put forward arguments that capitalism is racial. So what Cedric Robinson calls racialized capitalism, or racial capitalism. And not just race and class, there were regular debates in these Black Power groupings about gender. Even though they suffered often from misogyny, the women wouldn't be silenced. I've got some great documents on how these women were doing real interesting intersectional work very early, before it became trendy to do it in universities, right? And what you see in all these groupings is an attempt to link, and this is what I'm going to do most of the talk about, is to link the local struggle against racism in Britain with a global struggle for liberation across the entire world. So in many ways, British Black Power gives us a sense of a global politics that doesn't respect what Michael Gove would say is the island history of the UK, yeah? Because we all know that that's just bollocks. Because otherwise, how did I get here, right? All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the three elements that provide this global politics. And they're the political blackness, which is a very controversial term, the anti-imperialism, and this perennial problem of the white working class. And I'm going to show you how they all link up together. Okay. So let's start with this quote. This is Stokely Carmichael talking about his visit to London and his talking at the Liberation Conference. And he says, I wasn't surprised to see militant African Caribbean youth embracing the call. These youth were second generation and weren't about to accept the condensation and abuse that their parents had endured. No surprise there. What did surprise me was to hear Black Power resonating and to see the raised fists in the Asian communities, especially amongst Pakistani youth. And so what Stokely Carmichael was kind of perturbed by, because there were other places he'd visit and he would see this kind of Afro-Asian unity and actually say, oh, hold on, that's a bad thing. Quite famously when he went to Trinidad. And the groupings there responded to him and said, take off your tie, it makes you look bourgeois, right? But what he was pushing towards is the idea that there was a political identity amongst these new Commonwealth migrants based on a shared history of colonial oppression. And what you find often in these groupings is the term black is not taken to be synonymous with one ethnic grouping, but is an umbrella term for all of the new Commonwealth groups. So quite famously, Sivanandan, the director of the Institute for Race Relations, would say black was not the colour of our skin, but the colour of our politics. The idea of this was that there were different groupings of Asian, African, and Caribbean communities who would form a political subject, a black political subject, driven by forms of state racism and a kind of shared antagonism towards immigration control, police harassment, and also racial violence. And one of the other things that was driving this kind of idea of a sense of unity between these groupings was that the economy essentially was turning new Commonwealth migrants into very, very similar economic actors. So in 1968, there's a study which basically showed that 72% of new Commonwealth migrants who came from a white-collar background had been turned into industrial labor. So what often happened with new Commonwealth migration was you were dealing with a large array of people from various countries in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean who claimed with different class trajectories. But because of structural racism, essentially they were turned into very, very similar economic subjects. So they would become manual laborers, unskilled laborers, because of racial discrimination in terms of getting into white-collar jobs. Just to give you anecdotal evidence, my grandfather came from Fiji. He was a bank teller. But when he got here, he couldn't get a job in a bank. So he used to basically sweep the floors and work hard in the Goodyear tire factory in Wolverhampton. Right? So you have people, class trajectory being pushed towards the bottom, the worst jobs. And of course you had trade union discrimination, which didn't see coloured workers as real workers. They saw them as a reserve army of labour that essentially was there to destabilise the working class movement. And linked to this, you also had racist violence. Different groups suffered different forms of racial violence. For the Afro-Caribbean community, it was predominantly police brutality, but also racist murders. And for the Asian community, it was predominantly racial attack from various far-right groups. So what you find in UK Black Power, and I haven't got to the gist of this yet, it's something I'm working on, is whether it originates the term or just adopts this idea of political blackness. But all of the Black Power groups that I label there, even the ones that are not really Afrocentric, when you read their kind of their pamphlets and their ideology, they are politically black in the sense that they see all non-white people as being under this community. So, for example, if you look at the United Coloured People's Association's kind of formal declaration about what Black Power is, they talk about brothers and sisters from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. You find this replicated in the Panthers, in the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and even the more kind of culturally nationalist Black Liberation Front. What's interesting here is that ethnicities aren't denied. So you have this idea of being, say, an Indian or a Pakistani, or being from Jamaica, or being from Ghana, but you fall under this umbrella of the black subject. And it was aimed to kind of create solidarity around shared issues, but also specific communal issues that other communities were having, that other communities may lend their support to. And this is the real difference between UK Black Power and US Black Power. Because it's the kind of, I call it, it's what gives Black Power here its UK accent. It's what gives it a certain kind of twang. And it creates more of a global link because the migrant communities in the UK at this point are far more globally diverse than the African American community in the US, just geographically, because you're coming from different corners of the world, quite literally, because of the nature of the British Empire. And what you see is that there's shared solidarity around certain forms of discrimination. So there's campaigns against police racism and brutality, there's campaigns against racial violence, such as the rise of the National Front, which was formed in 1967. You would often hear terms like Paki bashing, nigger hunting. These were things that communities were having to deal with. And quite famously, Toza Ali was killed in the East End in 1970. I've come across a whole slew of petrol bomb attacks in London from 1971 to 73 that these Black Power groups are constantly talking about in their publications. They campaigned against colour bars in the workplace, and they campaigned against immigration controls. These were a kind of shared idea of what it was to be a black subject. So you find this in the literature. This is one of the Black Panther movement's collection of pamphlets. This is a protest against police brutality. All right, if someone gets who that little Asian guy is, I'll give him £10 and a pint. Sorry, I got no. Good try though. I would never give you £10 and a pint if I thought you were going to get it. It's actually a guy called Sidney Chopra, who is now one of the highest ranking members of the Indian Communist Party. He was actually over here studying African studies at SOAS and joined the Black Panther movement. And there's a whole bunch of people who you probably you'll know their names, who were part of the Black Panther movement, like Darcus Howe, like Neil Clenlock, like Olive Morris, who you will find out about. And you can see here about this sense of unity purposely coming through. This is again a Black Panther Party newsletter against the immigration bill in 1971. And it's this idea, again, that black people are on the move. We are on the move. 10,000 black people demonstrate against the racist immigration bill. Notice here that when it starts, it's 10,000 Asians, African, and West Indians took to the streets of London. So the black is the umbrella term and everyone else sits underneath it. And it provided forms of solidarity like this. So when Tozi Ali was killed in 1970 in the East End, the Black Panthers actually went and patrolled the streets for the local Pakistani community. They worked with the Pakistani Workers' Association and other groupings. And this is an ex-Panther called Harley, who says it was about getting justice with the police. The police were more racist than people on the street. If you had people beat, who did you call? Paki bashing or whatever, black bashing, you couldn't go to the police. We would dress in Panther gear and go around and patrol the street. So that was the nature of the forms of solidarity created by this shared identity. Now, if in contemporary debates you say stuff like this, people get quite angry because it's like, well, you know, you're erasing everyone. It's not the point. Political blackness wasn't organic. It had friction. Often groups would fall out with each other. Asians, for example, struggled to see themselves as black. Caribbeans and Africans often debated the term whether they were black, often seeing themselves as rather as the point of country of where they came from. So if you were from Jamaica, you were Jamaican. This idea of being black wasn't yet necessarily widespread, so much so that the Black Panther movement changes its name in 1973 to the Black Workers Movement because it doesn't feel that it can reach the Asian community as much because of the idea of the Panthers being a black nationalist organization. Sivanandan, who was probably the greatest post-war Marxist in this country from a New Commonwealth perspective, basically says that this was an overhang of the colonial subdivision between coolie and slave, and that groups couldn't get on all the time. And there were kind of moments where this shared identity really comes under stress, and that would be the Kenyan crisis when Asians are expelled from Kenya in the late 60s, and of course the Ugandan crisis when Idi Amin expels his Asian population back to the UK. But what seemed to knit these people together wasn't necessarily just this local politics, but it was a global politics and this global idea of anti-imperialism. And that's what I want to deal with next. Anti-imperialism. Y'all know who these people are? It's bad, and it's like being in class, I just keep asking you questions. Anyone know? Their names are there, but don't read that. Play along. Can you name them? Are you just going to read? All right, that's Nehru, that's Nkrumah, that's General Nasser, that's Sukarno, and that's Tito. This is the founding meeting of the non-aligned movement. Does anyone know what the non-aligned movement was? Right? All right, we'll get into that. After the war, the emergence of decolonisation across most of what we call the Third World led to what Vijay Prasad calls the emergence of a Third World project. This was a rival geopolitical, geoeconomic grouping for the capitalist West and the communist East. It's the one you don't get taught about in the Cold War. What you see there is a re-articulating of the human away from colonial categories that had basically disavowed the humanity of brown and black people, and a re-articulating of certain forms of claims around bread, so a new international economic order that would allow ex-colonies to develop properly, peace, the non-aligned movement, which would not be drawn into the onset of a nuclear holocaust, and of course justice and retribution for the 250 years of imperial domination. And you find that in the non-aligned movement, the G77 grouping, and UNCTAD, which was the UN Conference on Trade and Development. These were arenas where ex-colonies grouped together and put forward a different agenda for global politics. And this is the often forgotten global context of black power. So when you go back to interviews with Panthers in the UK, they say stuff like this. We were demonstrating about Angola, Ethiopia, Vietnam, you know, all the independent struggles and the links with the workers in the Caribbean, in Guyana, Trinidad. I mean, all of that was very much part of the international perspective. And what you find is that the articulation of this black political subject is inherently linked to this idea of an anti-imperial project. So if you go back and you read some of the pamphlets and the newspapers, British Black Power is founded on the idea of propagating solutions of our problems on international levels. Black people here are seen to be third world people, even though they're claiming the idea that they are Black Britons. And what Black Power does in the UK is to narrate its struggle as kind of a decolonial struggle in the core of empire. So anti-imperialism at home and abroad are the only solutions to the problems of a globalized, racialized capitalism. And this cuts across the color line. So you'll often find these groupings, they're not only dismissive of kind of Western powers, but they hate third world dictators. So, you know, you'll find that the Black Panther movement is highly critical of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, and of course, the kind of fallen legend that is Eric Williams' premiership in Trinidad, where he basically shuts down the emergent Black Power movement there with kind of dictatorial means. And the argument there is that actually the Black Power struggle here, the domestic forms of struggles against racism here, were linked to a form of global consciousness and global solidarity. And you can see this in some of the literature. So this is a national conference on the rights of Black people in Britain. And you'll notice that the kind of the icons that are used are very much like some of the kind of propaganda, especially being pointed out by China at this point, about the nature of the linkages between third world peoples. So they're very caricatured. But this is the idea, and the Black Panther movement and other Black Power groups were fundamentally behind this conference, were an attempt to try and see their struggle in terms of global terms. You see this again in newsletters, and regularly across many of the newspapers that these groups put out, you would see an international section. Again, the iconography of male revolutionaries, from Che to Bobby Seale to Chairman Mao. And the linkages of stuff. So you would often get spreads like this where the international section would say stuff, give you pictures from, say, South Africa, Palestine, and you'll see that the causes are linked together. Oppressed people are on the move. UK racial oppression is seen in a global context. And I love these little phrases there. Like I think they honestly did believe this. The days of international capitalism are numbered. How little did they know? Or maybe they knew more than we care to admit. Again, linking with this is Black Voice from the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and it's talking about Amir Cabral, who was the revolutionary in Guinea-Bissau. You would see regular updates on Frelimo, the Black Panthers of Israel, which is a really interesting history in itself, and linkages between anti-racism here and the indigenous movement in Australia. That's Bobby Sykes, who's kind of my most famous Aboriginal rights activist of that era. She actually was brought over here by the Black Unity and Freedom Party to talk. And you would see regular things like this. You would see regular meetings bringing people together in support of the struggle of suffering of Black people in Trinidad and Tobago, where you get to hear people like C.L.R. James and John LaRose. These would have been my kind of gigs if I was living around back then. And you'd also see the bringing in of American activists. This is George Jackson's, I'm sure this is George Jackson's, no, it's George Jackson. This is someone linked to the Soledad brothers, brought over, their mother was brought over to talk, but George Jackson's sister was also brought over to talk. This kind of set up a global idea of what Black Power in the UK was about. And what it then did, it allowed these groups to do is to make a kind of critique of what the working class and the white working class was as a concept. So again, this is another interview with an ex-Black Panther movement member. And they said the Black Panther movement here, we were very much, the overall kind of philosophy was Marxist. We studied Marxism, and that the Panther movement eventually changed its name to the Black Workers' Movement. Not all of the Black Power groups were Marxist. This is one I picked out from a newspaper from the Black Liberation Front. And it says, it ends with, we are blacks with a great number of historical peculiarities. Therefore, I must maintain that crude Marxism could not do away with our condition as blacks, right? But in the main, Black Power here was anti-capitalist. And what it did, often, is provide an analysis, an anti-capitalist analysis of racism. So this is from the Black Unity and Freedom Party, and it was in most of its papers. This is his manifesto, and you'll see here it says, number 1, we recognize the class nature of this society. And then it's number 2, we recognize the necessity for class struggle and the absolute necessity for the seizure of state power by the working class and the bringing about of socialism. That's standard left-wing stuff, right? Then it says here, we recognize that imperialism has been able to inject its racist ideology into every section of society. However, since the white working class is also exploited under capitalism/imperialism, we must recognize the contradiction between the white working class and the ruling class to be a fundamental one. So that was, we understand. But then they were like, but the contradiction between black people and the ruling class is therefore a principal contradiction, and the contradiction between the black people and the white working class is only secondary. The argument here is that the visceral racism that these communities were often experiencing was in a sense just a masquerade for capitalist oppression in general, and that the white working class had basically been corrupted by a form of racism that didn't allow them to see that they really should be on the side of other oppressed groups. So how to solve a problem like the white working class is a perennial problem of these groups. And their main target was this form of racism. So if you could be, anti-racism wasn't just simply about trying to create integration, it was about trying to create revolutionary activity by showing other people that their oppression was necessarily the same oppression as the new Commonwealth migrants. And what emerges is a very sophisticated critique of class as a concept from these groupings. So you'll often hear them say, well, it's no point talking about national problems. We need to globalize this. We need to think about what's happening in the third world because we're linked to people in the third world. And what is the white left here doing about these things? They would challenge this idea that there was an aristocracy of labor, that labor here was somehow more precious than labor in the third world. And they often critiqued the trade union movement and the Labour Party especially when the Labour Party used to basically elicit anti-New Commonwealth sentiment in order to push forward its own agenda. And they were global revolutionaries. Their very basic argument was, well, so what if you have social democracy in this country? If you don't treat us like equals, how are you going to treat other people outside of here like equals? But this didn't mean that they then evacuated the concept of the working class or the cause of white people. You often found calls for black workers to unite with their fellow workers. You'd often see calls for them to support strikes. This is a miners' strike up here. This is a Black Panther movement paper talking about the need to support miners in their struggles with management. And this is another one talking about workers' struggles in the Upper Clyde. So there was a global agenda and a global idea of what it was to be part of the working class. So in 1977, Olive Morris basically offers a wonderful critique of social democracy and ideas of class that simply focus on a national thing. She said, all of the progress that the welfare state capitalism had brought forwards from the post-war era onwards had really struggled to develop the internationalism amongst the British working class. So the Black Power movement in this country was essentially a big critique of welfare capitalism. This idea that you just provide a state and everyone gets on and we have safety nets. For the Black Power movement here wasn't good enough. A, because it didn't deal with forms of global inequality, but also because the very foundations of social democracy were based on a racialization and linked to a concept of whiteness. This might sound familiar if you've been paying attention for the last 18 months. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, just to give you a recap on the history. Black power in the UK after the kind of mid-70s would transform and morph. There'd be forms of state repression against it. They've even made fancy TV shows with Idris Elba in it these days about UK black power. It's all very kind of fictional in my opinion. And you'd have oppression in things like the Mangrove show trials, which were about a restaurant and basically people used to go to this restaurant, but really it was about police corruption and trying to infiltrate black power groups. You would see black power influence future black activism. So resistance to police brutality, which would become a hallmark of the early 80s, can be linked back to the emergence of that radical that radical resistance in the early 70s. So I'm talking about a kind of linear thing that runs from Notting Hill in 1958, but to these other disturbances in the early 80s, such as Brixton, Toxteth, and Birmingham. The Black People's Day of Action, of course, against the New Cross Fire. I think Les Back came and talked to you about that. So you should all know what that is. Yeah. The Asian youth movements that would emerge in the early 80s were very much informed by this past history. Like I said, it's become very topical nowadays. But in many ways, its history lays dormant sociologically. Now, what I want to do is kind of just in the last bit, trying to draw out, well, what does this mean for us? What can we do with this stuff, right? Because it's important to retrieve history and to bear witness to history. But I'm not interested in history. I'm interested in revolution. So it's about how can we use this stuff to put forward the idea of a more radically egalitarian society. So let's look at recovering what we can recover, right? So Amir Sivarandan, who still is the director of the Institute for Race Relations, said in 2014 that the anti-racist struggle as we know it is over. We've got to fight new racism such as xeno-racism and anti-Muslim racism that globalization and the war on terror have thrown up, within the larger framework for the fight against the growing state authoritarianism and its bedfellows, fascism. And we've got to fight the idea that there's a good capitalism and that the market state will give us a good society. I really don't like disagreeing with Sivanandan, but I actually think that UK Black Power does all of this already. That its legacy already does all of these things. And in many ways, we just need to remember elements of it to help us in our own fight. So how would we do that? Well, political blackness, much maligned. Whenever I do stuff about political blackness, it ends up into this weird debate where people go, you're not black, I'm black, and someone else will go, no, I'm black, and you have like 20 minutes of this. So if anyone wants to do that, please don't do that here, right? Because I ain't just like, look, I'm quite happy with being brown. Sociologically, it's been run through different critiques. A very famous sociologist called Tariq Madood basically said it homogenizes all groupings, Asians are silenced in it. My best friend just ran a recent critique saying, his name's Kennedy Andrews, said it was anti-ethnically black and methodologically nationalist. I don't particularly disagree with what they're saying, but it's not the complete history of that concept. And it's not also what it can give to us. Black Power in the UK's version of political blackness seems to offer us a different story, one where you can see different ethnicities working under an umbrella term, bringing stuff and re-articulating stuff across post-colonial and colonial fault lines, right? And it's a sense of solidarity. Well, your struggle may be different, but we're still linked because this is an oppressive system. So while we might not want to bring that stuff back, we may want to bring a shared sense of solidarity back, even when we think, well, that's got nothing to do with me. So to give you an example, if you're against police brutality and the overrepresentation of, say, Afro-Caribbean men in the prison system, you may also be against security companies like G4S, who essentially police the border against different forms of bodies. And G4S, who's actually one of the biggest employers on the African continent. If you follow the linkages, you'll often bump into a fellow oppressed group. I think the idea of political blackness essentially does that for us. We don't need to return to this idea everyone's black to retrieve that element of that history. So when we come up against idiocies like Brexit, it's very easy to see where your cause should be. It should be with fellow oppressed people, even if they don't look like it. And this links to an idea of anti-imperialism. Many of the times, anti-racism in this country has turned into a methodological nationalism, just to focus on the national state. You've seen this in debates recently about how many people are attending Oxford and all of these things, right? Now that's great and all, and I wish more people would go and have a really disturbed, working class minorities would go to Oxford and have a disturbed experience. But it's not really going to solve our problems in the sense that, well, just because you have more of us there doesn't mean that you're going to have actually radicalism in these institutions, right? The older form of what Black Power was talking about was actually our solutions need to be globalized because our history links us to these things. Now, many of us might think, well, that's got nothing to do with me right now, but I still got family in Fiji. Many of you people will still have family across the world. If you don't have, it's still better to think globally than nationally. And this idea that anti-racism is just about BME representation and legal inclusion is actually a red herring. It's not the radical agenda of anti-racism. It's not the radical agenda that UK Black Power talked about. Dealing with the problems of a global economy that I'm sorry, these are like kind of weird sociological terms, like disarticulated Fordism. But that just basically means, you know how your iPhone is designed in California but assembled in China and all of its other parts come from other places? That's really what we should be dealing with. Because that's what creates the exploitation and death that encounters our modern society. But if you want to go to Oxford, it's all great, okay? And this links back to the class politics of the Black Power movement, critiquing these ideas of a return to global Britain under Brexit. You'll notice that Empire 2.0 was brought out. If we're just going to try and recreate Empire, I'm heading out of it. And also left-wing ideas, I call them left-wing forms of National Socialism, which normally pisses people off about these things. But it's this idea of, well, you know, Brexit will lead to this idea of we'll have this left-wing haven here. That's not going to happen, people. I mean, it's really not. Because the reality of the world is an unbalanced, unequal society where migrants trek across large bits of Africa, stumble upon a bit of Spain in Morocco, go Melilla, and see two idiots playing golf as their first bit of Western civilization. It's linked to this massive disparities in wealth between the regions. Don't believe the hype that the rest of the world is catching up with the West. It's not actually that true, apart from select places. And also, if you happen to live in various bits of the world, you will live less than when you live here, even in a crumbling NHS. And this brings us back to this last point. In recent months, years, the concept of the white working class has returned. It's returned with great visceralness and great visibility. It's an oldie and goodie, right? We can divide the people. So now the indigenous English turns on everyone, not just non-white people, but Eastern Europeans and anyone else who might be foreign. When we talk about the history of decline in this country and we talk about people being left behind, we need to go back to the history that we're talking about, because some people weren't even in the game to be left behind. They've just been left behind since they got here. The history of the rise and fall of manufacturing cannot be taken away from the destruction of empire. This is the warning of British Black Power. If you don't deal with these issues, you're going to head towards a nationalist and racist politics. And so I call this era the wages of whiteness in the absence of wages. What does that mean? It means that we are constantly supplied with an idea of a white nation state, an idea that we can have this ethnically sealed state where everyone has a job and all these other things. And that's just so the elites can go by and not give you a job. What do we need to do? We need to, in my opinion, we need to re-articulate the radicalness of anti-racism for this new environment and not seek to join what Malcolm X called the house. That was when you just sold out and joined the house. You need to talk about people in the field, the ones who do the hard work, the oppressed. So what does that mean? So I'm going to end it. I'll give you two alternatives. One alternative we're going to celebrate a year of, and you'll see that those wages of whiteness may lead us to nuclear destruction, or we could return to a different form of critique. One that takes the idea that rising inequality in the UK and other Western economies is actually linked to global processes that show a rise in the incomes of the 1% and a rise in the incomes of the middle classes in the global south, but everyone else has fallen flat. This is the famous elephant graph of Branko Milanovic. And then we might return back to ideas that the working class is not white, that when it dies, it's actually international. It's from various places across the world. And then just to end, I'll take you back to Olive. Olive Morris writes in 1977, so this is a couple of years before she passes away, actually. She writes a pamphlet with her partner, and it's a big critique of the whole afterplay of the Black Power movement and also the kind of anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism and all these other things dealing with this thing. And she says this, she says, today increasingly the British working class is faced with a choice either to defend the national interest or throw their lot in with the oppressed people of the third world. The most immediate way in which this can be done is for us to support the struggle of third world people in this country. Now, in many ways, that language is archaic. It doesn't really have the resonance. But I think Olive is still on the money. I think she's 100% correct. That if you really want to be at the core of pushing things forwards today, then your anti-racism needs to be a globalized, internationalized perspective that puts your lot in with other oppressed peoples, that recognizes your privileges and seeks to demolish them. Anything else is just going to be a national disaster. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. That was excellent.
I don't got to confess stuff now, right?
No.
We're just going to talk about the work.
You beat up the audience. Wonderful. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, so we'll turn it over quite soon. There's so much in there. But I'm going to use the opportunity to ask a question that's kind of been circulating in my head for a while about other things. I had been reading Sylvia Wynter lately, who I admire so greatly, and she raises a question in one piece of writing about what do aesthetics do, and talks about this this idea of kind of developing like a conspecificity across differences. And I was thinking about this, I've been thinking about this a lot, but I was thinking about this particularly in relation to political blackness. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, as this umbrella term, or as this politics is being kind of cultivated, what draws it together, and does aesthetics play a role in it?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I think the thing that pulls it together, and I think what debates in this country have missed, is the anti-imperialism element.
Okay.
Because most people see it as like a skin color thing. Like, we're all non-white, so we're in the fight together, which kind of is there, but I think it's the anti-imperialism of the era which has really been forgotten. It's that globalized context of where people have come from. So to give you an example, the Indian Workers Association is founded in this country initially to support Indian independence. Once that's achieved, its remit is expanded to deal with kind of trade union activity, but also to deal with an idea of solidarity between people in the motherland, or in the belly of the beast, depends how you want to see it, and those outside of it. So I think that was the kind of element that's been forgotten in that, and that's, you find that a lot in the kind of, they're kind of caricatures. They're third world caricatures, but then they represent kind of, they're very, very similar to Chinese propaganda. If we got some Chinese propaganda from communist China in the 70s about oppressed people in the third world, they look very much like that. So I think that's the kind of element that's been forgotten, because we've fallen into a debate about, well, that era was just rubbish. And my argument is, well, we don't need to valorize it, we don't necessarily need to criticize it, we just need to extract what we need out of it. And what we find in it is an aesthetic that kind of tries to link groupings, tries to link certain groups together.
Links them together. And can you, is there a nuance in relation to the introduction of this specificity in British Black Power and identity politics? And you know, maybe you could flesh that out a little bit.
I'm not going to bash it, because like, this is dangerous politically, right? Because like we set up this divide and we go, oh yeah, identity politics came along in the 80s and ruined everything for everybody, right? And then like all my white bro socialists are all like, yeah, that's not true. Essentially, identity politics was inherent in this era, because the concept of class needs to be expanded to encompass everybody who essentially comes with an identity, right?
Yeah.
So whether you're an immigrant, whether you're a woman, whether you're a minority, whether those intersect across the things, it's a false divide to like have this, well, we went from here to identity politics.
Okay.
And I always see identity as key to all of these struggles. So you find it in the US Black Power movement, you find it in the UK Black Power movement. Different identities come into play.
Yes. Okay. Okay. And another thing that, and this will be my last comment, and then we'll open it. you were talking about a Fanon conference that you attended a while ago, and one quote from Fanon that rings with me is the idea that power regionalizes and divides. And I was thinking about that a lot when you were talking about the nationalism and relating that or contrasting that with thinking internationally or thinking globally. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, like, you know, the situation that we're in now, where we're seeing this kind of resurgence of nationalist discourses and this kind of thing. Can you articulate that or shed light on that in light of, say, Fanon?
Say Fanon? Well, I always start my talks with Fanon, which the reason we talk about Fanon is because he got it right.
Yeah.
He kind of foresaw that this would fall apart and we'd head towards maybe because when I teach Fanon, I never teach my students the conclusion until I've really taught the rest of the book, because kids tend to head straight towards the back of the book. They all get really happy that we're going to have liberation and they head off. And I'm like, no, the book is actually really bleak. It's about how everything's going to go wrong, right? And so I think we're dealing with the after effects of the fall of this kind of politics, the inability of class politics to keep up, and the return of a visceral racism, because essentially the conditions of the West they're not heading towards the global South, but they're basically heading downwards, right? You see this across the states, where it's not just the white working class, it's the white middle class as well, have essentially been displaced from having power. And so the concept I talked about earlier, which is the wages of whiteness in the absence of wages, is about, it's not the last stand of white supremacy, but it's the last time I think Donald Trump and films like Brexit are the kind of last time white supremacy is going to be able to get away with it, right? Because essentially, white people in general, or whiteness, is not the most powerful thing on the planet anymore. There are other actors, and I'm not valorizing them, they may not be nice either, but there are other and it's actually a far more scarier place. So like when Trump starts talking about he's going to bomb North Korea, we're actually really scared, because these North Koreans may not take that, right? The Chinese are geopolitical actors in themselves, so are the Indians, and the Indians have turned kind of fascist. So, you know, it's a scary place.
Yes.
So in many ways, we're dealing with what Fanon saw coming, which is this nightmare of a disintegrated kind of global sphere where hope is only in small pockets.
Yeah, disintegrated global sphere. Thank you. I'd like to open it up if there are any questions from, we've got, because it's recorded, we have to do it.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Rather than a question, it's more like I'm more curious to know where would you place James Baldwin as an activist, as an artist within this context, and also because he did go to Angela Davis while she was in prison, but as well as a hope for the artist to, in general, to kind of like propose perhaps like a different approach, which I wouldn't use the words poetic, because you guys are going to be slanted by the Goldsmiths institution, but...
Oh, is it that bad?
What would you think?
Do you want to get a couple, or do you want to get a few, or do you just want me to do one?
Yeah, just one.
One is it?
Yeah.
Okay, so James Baldwin's a really kind of interesting character in the midst of this, because he's both at the fore in the US context, is right in the middle, but he's also detached, right? So Baldwin escapes to Europe, and then sees the civil rights movement happening and is compelled to go back. And in some ways, Baldwin's writings give a kind of more global perspective on things about where you could find freedom, where you can't find freedom. And what Baldwin does is essentially provide a liberal humanism way out of maybe the dichotomies that the other groups have put forward. Because like the Black Power movement is essentially like revolution or nothing. And maybe James Baldwin is giving the West and us a different way out. Whether you want to say that that's the right way out or not, I don't know. But he doesn't just necessarily put forward revolution, but puts the kind of base humanity that we're all there together. So that's why I always see Baldwin as this kind of really interesting interlocutor between things. And he's very interesting. I was at Stanford, where the Huey P. Newton archives are, and you see letters from Newton to Baldwin saying, "Will you review my book?" Because Baldwin's still seen as this like kind of stamp of intelligence. So I think Baldwin sits in between those kind of poles, Does that make sense? I don't know if I solved your.
Yeah, no, it's more thinking about like the idea as well of how the role of identity today, as you say, it's more like white or black. I think we all lack it.
Yeah.
Identity is hard to like.
Yeah, and I just think what you'd get from Baldwin if you brought it with this stuff is that those identities need, if we want to achieve, if you do have a concept of liberation, it's not going to work just by going, we're all this one class. You're going to have to bring these identities, their intersections and their interests into conversation about what it is that what liberation means.
Get your exercise.
I've just got a question about where normative notions of sovereignty and self-determination come into play. When you refer to the origins of political blackness, you pointed to the non-aligned movement. Another term that's sort of associated with that is the unknown spirit, which refers to the original conference in 1955 of the Afro-Asian conference held in Bandung, Indonesia. And what was sort of paradoxical about that condition was that it was 29 newly independent nations collecting in a spirit of self-determination, itself being individual nations. So it's a conflict in internationalism there. And we would see that from there on, despite that energy, that spirit of anti-imperialism or anti-racism, many of the countries at that conference, 3 of the 5 organizers, if I'm not wrong, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and who else? Basically ran clear-cut genocidal regimes against ethnic minorities in their countries. So I just wanted to sort of hone in on nationalism, sovereignty, and self-determination.
Cool. That's a great question.
Yeah.
So every history comes with its own contradictions, right? So what I didn't tell you there is, if you look at Black Power as a kind of global grouping, it essentially is trying to wrestle with the problems that had emerged from the Bandung era and the ideas of nationalism. Because, so why do you get Black Power, Dalit Black Panthers in India? Because the state formation cannot provide them with the social, political, and economic forms of justice that they need. And it's very similar to the state formation in Britain. And it's the same in the US context, where the civil rights movement as a state formation, a remodeling of a state formation, is seen to be unable to bring forwards what these groups think about liberation. So what you get is a kind of questioning of the very kind of anti-colonial ideas of national sovereignty and self-determination by these groupings. So Huey Newton's idea of intercommunalism, for example, is basically leads to a form of anarchism, right? And these other groupings in, say, Britain aren't necessarily interested, well, they are kind of upfront about seizing the state, but what they're interested in is creating community organizations that can serve their people. So in some ways, a lot of these groups were taking the kind of critique of nationalism and trying to embed them in forms of community and community democracy that necessarily wouldn't fall into those traps. You have to see them as having a dialogue with the kind of great imperial movements that came before them. And that's where the idea of sovereignty and what constitutes self-determination becomes slightly more complex than let's just create our own nation state and let's have a nation state and then we can start just killing off people. So that's why you see them critiquing Eric Williams in Trinidad or critiquing Haile Selassie in Ethiopia or other, eventually they turn on. So one of the things about Idi Amin is initially they're like, oh, Idi Amin is a revolutionary leader, he should be allowed to say what he wants in his states. You see the Black Panther movement's paper at the point say, well, the Asians in Uganda are bourgeois, and then eventually they come to the conclusion, well, hold on, Idi Amin is an imperialist, and this form of nationalism is regressive. So that's actually they're having a conversation with those terms of self-determination and nationalism and interrogating them and showing their flaws.
Did that answer? Yeah, that's great. Any other questions? Yep, back. Sorry. We could take more than one, but it's nice.
Yeah.
I like the...
Oh, sure.
sense, because I mean, you were talking about this idea of the Black Power movement turning its head towards anti-capitalism and capitalist structures, as well as the formation of the nation state, post-imperialism, decolonialization. But then I'm just kind of wondering, like, how would you visualize what the revolution actually might look like? Is it end game some type of like complete deconstruction of nation states or capitalist structures? Like, do we reform nation states, like even like in the context of like post-colonial Asia or Africa? I mean, there's that first liberation movement of the people in that country, but then they're also living in a country that's still demarcated by post-colonial or colonial conquest, in a sense. Like, it's like, what does it mean to be a free Ghanaian country that's still kind of, its borders are defined by colonialism, in a sense? So it's like, how would you like, visualize what revolution actually looks like?
Great, easy question, huh? It's actually a great question. And I'm not going to give you a full answer because actually I couldn't, it would be wrong for me to go, here's the blueprint, go do this. I don't think that's going to happen, right? And even if I give you a blueprint, it's probably not going to happen. But we have to come to a point where we start to question some of our received wisdoms. And one of the things that I've got out of the Black Power movement is that although we might cling to ideas of, say, statehood and nationalism and borders, even in a progressive sense, we have to be aware of their limitations. So I'm not like a big advocate for, I'm not saying like, let's just have all open borders, but I'm saying eventually, would we not want a place of open borders? I don't know. I mean, I personally would like that, where you could go to a place and get the same provision that you pay in somewhere else, right? These are forms of things, of questions that we have to have a conversation about. And in terms of going back to that history, is to actually just reinvigorate the conversation about what it is that we should do going forwards. Like, should we have a debate about, and we are having this debate in this country about whether people who aren't seen as national citizens should have certain things given to them. So last week, for example, we started asking people about their immigration status before we're apparently going to treat them in NHS hospitals. So in many ways, we just have to go back to re-inflecting the debate with these kind of global ideas. And then I'm a big fan of the people, hopefully, will come together and sort out the kind of logistics of these things. If you ask me personally, is the nation state going to disappear? I don't know. As a world policy, I hope so. But it doesn't mean that it will happen. It's about reinvigorating that debate. So it's just a debate about, I do classes sometimes, and I say stuff like, well, you know, I feel that that wealth should be distributed equally. And what you find is that really pisses people off when you say that. Some people are like, no, I don't agree with that. I think this person's lazy. I think poor people are unintelligent people who can't make it in society. In many ways, before we get to the fun stuff about how we're going to divvy up the world together, we need to deal with the logistics of, essentially, how can we get our views and values, and you know, I put mine on the table, they're left-wing views and values, how can we get them back into popular discourse? How can we stop them being nationalized? How can we have people, I've had debates with people who support Jeremy Corbyn, for example, articulate what I think are kind of weird racist ideas towards migrants. So it's about how do we re-inflect political debate, and part of that is retrieving that history. But I'm sure you've got great ideas about how to divvy up the world as well. So hopefully when we get to that position, we can all come together and divide it up fairer. So I'm sorry, I can't answer your question.
That's a good question. Are there other questions? I have one. Sorry, I have to use a mic. I know that you're working on the welfare state at the moment, or you're moving into work around the welfare state. And something you were talking about a while ago, the idea of a link possibly between the welfare state and nationalist values. Is that what I was hearing before? I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so my kind of current work is heading towards looking at how welfareism is inherently nationalized and is inherently wrong to be nationalized. So if you look at what the Black Power movement is doing. It's essentially drawing out this idea that there's an international spread of labour, of processes, which necessarily have ended up in Britain, and that actually people don't have the right to simply just go, well, this is ours, and you need to get lost. And so you can see this playing out in contemporary society. So as we move to a kind of place where we're saying, well, we need to control immigration, we need to do all of these things, we'll readily steal everyone else's resources under the idea of we're bringing in skilled labour.
Right.
So I haven't been treated by a kind of British, in any kind of context, any colour, creed, doctor in about at least 10 years. They've normally got an Indian twang or a Pakistani twang, and they've been brought in, right? But we don't have a debate about that. We don't have a debate about how developing countries essentially pay for key elements of our welfare system. We don't pay for that. We then bring them over here, pay them a wage, and then we simply take those resources. And then when you go back into bits of the developing world, you can't find a doctor. So when we're going to have a debate about immigration, well, maybe we should have a debate about who's coming in, right? And where they're coming from, and how we're actually kind of maybe stealing resources.
Interesting.
And I think that part of that history is linked to this.
I'm just curious because I'm adding one more thing on this, but trying to phrase this. Okay, so if there is a welfare state, is that more readily cultivated, the mindset of it, in more endogenous societies? Because this is one thing I've been curious about. Because I come from the States, everything's privatized, so I greatly admire having things like the NHS. But I'm also interested in what I note when the systems where I've seen it working quote unquote well tend to be much more homogenous. So Scandinavia, these kind of things, where they're and for various reasons they are. So I'm wondering if that link between a kind of that the idea that a welfare state might function better, quote unquote, if it's more culturally homogenous, which I see as problematic.
So I think the key to flip that on its head is to actually, that only works when we have an idea that we need an ethnically homogenous society to create forms of solidarity between people, right? Yeah. I don't think we necessarily need to do that, do we? I mean,
so it goes back to your argument.
It goes back to the argument of you form forms of solidarity based on a shared humanity, and maybe we could flip the debate. Let's not have a debate about how we could provide forms of welfare in an ethnically homogenized society, but how we could perform forms of welfare in a different system that prioritizes different forms of things. So getting rid of the idea of profit vis-a-vis provision of welfare, getting rid of the idea that we have to work so much in order to pay into a system. See, I'm just a lazy individual. I don't think people should work. I think you all should just be able to enjoy your life. They have a term for this now, like in trendy circles, they call it fully luxury automated communism. That just used to mean communism to me. All right, and then we can have a debate once we create sentient beings, and we can all have a Blade Runner kind of. We'll do a talk about Blade Runner, about whether it's right to exploit androids and robots. But really, we need to get to the idea of we should be providing not only forms of things like healthcare, but also leisure and a better form of life. And it's only by questioning the very concepts that we're given, such as capital, such as labor, such as welfare, such as nation, which this history did particularly well, that we can get to that point. Because if we just simply use the language of a repressor, we simply create forms of oppression.
That's a very good comment. It would have been a great ending. It's brilliant.
Sorry, that's the end.
I'm already in the bar.
Me too. So two things. One is the Kristen, you evoked the idea of the Scandinavian. And it struck me while you were saying that, that actually operates as a
okay, it does.
narrative that we tell ourselves, so that we can say, A, this won't work here. It won't work in a kind of diverse environment. And B,
want something like this to work, then we have to kick out.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. Just to clarify, I'm not. Yeah.
Kind of operates, we all kind of look at Scandinavian model and think, oh,
Yeah.
this is fantastic.
Yeah.
But that kind of belief operates as a kind of
Okay. Yeah.
The second point, the point I actually wanted to make was this. I don't know whether you've read Wendy Brown's recent work, she's talking about this kind of transition from neoliberalism to neo-fascism, and how the sets of discourses within neoliberalism paved the way for neo-fascism, specifically this kind of transmutation of the idea of freedom into the idea of non-coercion, freedom from coercion. I was wondering whether this kind of sets of languages around freedom are useful in your discourse, or useful in the kind of things that you're talking about, and how you might want to kind of reclaim certain ideas of freedom, or to try and talk about other forms of kind of social contracts in terms of like justice or equality, and kind of those sets of languages.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, I fully support the reclaiming or the rearticulation of concepts which essentially have lost their moorings in reality. So I often give talks at places and I use terms like liberation, and I can tell, especially young people, some of them are looking at me like, what the hell is he talking about? Like what? And the irony is, I'm telling you that liberation is something I can't fully define, so it makes it even worse, right? People are like, what do you mean? Apart from, he says he's anti-capitalist and we'd get rid of all of these structures, but he can't tell us how to get there, right? Well, I could say let's go and have an armed seizure of Goldsmiths and then let's branch out from Goldsmiths to Greater London. But, you know, then the prevent agenda might see me in jail. So I don't say things like that. But it is a sense of, I think many of the things that we need, many of the resources have already been said, but we've just forgotten that they were said. And I find it really, I'll give you an example. We live in the most apparently globalized society ever. Yet I find the political activism of some of these groupings far more global than people who can literally connect with each other in seconds. I find their sympathies and their solidarities far more appealing than Twitter. Not to dismiss Twitter, I think it's wonderful, but I just think there are forms of community activism and forms of solidarity and forms of a shared sense of humanity that we could recover by revisiting some of these terms. Not to valorize them, not to simply say that's as good as it gets, but to learn from them. So I think it's very important that we re-articulate those concepts. And maybe some of their old meanings were far better than how they've been colonized today.
Oh, last question. Or you could shout if you feel like it, or not, yeah. Or not shout.
I actually have a question for you, sorry.
That's okay.
Oh.
I have a kind of more general announcement, because let's say this at the beginning of the talk, but I guess you didn't get the slide. Two things. First one is that I am the department representative for the art department, and I wanted to give you all my email address so that you knew how to get in touch with me if there's anything you needed to kind of departmentally that you couldn't solve within your program. I'll make sure that maybe we can get that on the VLE somehow. So the idea of a department representative is that I'm kind of like the eyes, ears and voice of us as a student body between management and the rest of you. So any concerns, like you need to know how to be able to get in touch with me, so I'll make sure my email goes up somewhere. And then we have Ellen, who is here somewhere there, who is our accessibility and inclusion rep. So for all things related to that, get in touch with Ellen. But again, we'll figure out a way to get our contact details to you. The second thing is that the studio sessions are going to start up again after reading week. So for those that are new and don't know, studio sessions is like an informal way of the art students and the curation students to get to know each other. So it's like a studio visit, and as artists you can also come along. But yeah, it's a chance to present work and everyone get to know each other, so we can actually maybe work together rather than in the future and kind of use these two classes together, especially now that we're all in the same building. So the idea is that tomorrow at 3, Monica over there is going to put the list up on the announcement board in Deptford, and you can sign up if you're interested in giving a session. It's 30 minutes. They'll be running on Wednesday afternoons. Yeah, and sign up. It's a great thing to do and a great way to kind of get to know each other's work. It's also join the Facebook group, so you'll hear every week who is giving the session. It's MFA studio sessions, just request to join, get all the information through that. And it's also for curators. The idea is that this year we're going to integrate curators presenting their research as well as artists presenting their working process as we go through the session.
Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to John for an excellent talk. Thank you.